The face in the crowd shouldn't have existed. Dean Martin was halfway through Everybody Loves Somebody when his eyes locked onto a man in row 7, seat 12, and his voice caught mid-note. 43 years of separation collapsed into a single moment of impossible recognition. The man sitting in that velvet theater seat had the same dark eyes, the same sharp jawline, the same crooked smile that Dean saw in his own mirror every morning. But Antonio Crocetti was supposed to be dead, buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the Italian countryside during the war. Yet there he sat, older, grayer, wearing a working man's Sunday suit and staring back at his famous brother with tears streaming down his weathered face. The Riverside Theater in Steubenville, Ohio, was Dean's homecoming venue, a deliberate choice for his October 1959 concert tour. He'd wanted to perform in the blue-collar town that had shaped him, to sing for the steel workers and barbers and shopkeepers who'd known Dino Crocetti before he became Dean Martin. The theater's worn red velvet seats held 1,200 people, mill workers with calloused hands, their wives in carefully pressed dresses, teenagers who'd saved their allowances for tickets, and older Italian immigrants who remembered when the Crocetti family ran the barber shop on South 6th Street. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and working-class pride, punctuated by the distant rumble of the steel mills that never slept. Dean had chosen this venue precisely because it felt like home, like the world he'd left behind when ambition drove him to New York and eventually to stardom. But home, Dean was about to discover, held secrets that could shatter even the coolest performer's carefully constructed facade. Dean's childhood had been fractured by forces beyond his control. When he was 8 years old, his younger brother Antonio had been sent back to Italy to live with their grandmother. The family story, told in whispers over Sunday dinners, was that their parents couldn't afford to keep both boys during the worst years of the Depression. Antonio, 4 years younger, had been chosen for the journey because he was sickly, and their grandmother in Abruzzo claimed the mountain air would cure his weak lungs. The last memory Dean had of his brother was standing on a train platform in 1925, watching a crying 4-year-old being carried away by relatives he barely knew. Dean's parents had promised it was temporary, that Antonio would return when times got better. But times never got better enough, and then the war came, and letters from Italy stopped arriving. In 1943, word reached Steubenville that the village where Antonio lived had been bombed by retreating German forces. No survivors, the Red Cross reported. Antonio Crocetti was listed among the dead. Dean had carried that loss like a stone in his chest for 16 years, while he transformed himself from Dino Crocetti into Dean Martin. While he conquered nightclubs and recording studios and movie sets, part of him remained that 8-year-old boy on the train platform, wondering if his little brother had ever forgiven him for being the son who stayed behind. Now, in the middle of his homecoming concert, that little brother was staring back at him from row 7. Dean's voice faltered completely. The orchestra, confused by their leader's sudden silence, continued playing for a few bars before trailing off into uncertainty. 1,200 people sat in bewildered quiet, wondering if Dean Martin, the epitome of professional cool, was having some kind of breakdown. But Dean's eyes were locked on the man in row 7, and the man's eyes were locked on Dean. Slowly, incredibly, the stranger began to smile. The same lopsided grin that had gotten both Crocetti boys into trouble during their brief childhood together. And then, clear enough to carry across the theater's perfect acoustics, the man spoke 2 words that confirmed what Dean's heart already knew. "Hello, Dino." The theater erupted in confusion. People turned in their seats, trying to locate the source of the interruption. Ushers began moving toward row 7, unsure whether they were dealing with a heckler or something more serious. But Dean held up his hand, stopping everyone in their tracks. "Antonio." Dean's voice cracked like a teenager's. "My God, Tony, is that you?" The man in row 7 stood up slowly, his weathered face streaming with tears. "It's me, brother. It's really me." What happened next had never occurred in the history of American show business. Dean Martin, mid-performance, walked off the stage and into the audience. Not to the edge of the stage for banter with front-row patrons, but down into the theater itself, pushing past startled orchestra members, stumbling down the side steps, making his way through the narrow aisle toward row 7 like a man walking through a dream. When Dean reached his brother, his supposedly dead brother, his baby brother, who'd been 4 years old the last time they'd touched. They collapsed into each other's arms right there in the aisle. Two middle-aged Italian men, one famous and one unknown, sobbing like children while 1,200 people watched in stunned silence. "I thought you were dead," Dean whispered into Antonio's shoulder. "They told me you were dead. The bombing, I was supposed to be," Antonio replied, his English still touched with the accent of their childhood. "I was working in the fields that day. The bomb missed me by a quarter mile. But everything else, everyone else." They held each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, both of them crying openly, both of them overwhelmed by the impossible mathematics of resurrection and recognition. Finally, Dean pulled back and looked at his brother, really looked at him. Antonio was shorter than Dean remembered, his dark hair streaked with gray, his face lined by decades of outdoor work. His hands were rough and scarred, the hands of a man who'd made his living through physical labor, but the eyes were the same, dark and warm and unmistakably Crocetti. "How did you find me?" Dean asked. Antonio smiled through his tears. "I've been following your career for years. When I finally made it to America in 1952, the first thing I did was buy every Dean Martin record I could find. I knew it was you the moment I heard your voice on the radio. You still sound like the brother who used to sing me to sleep." 1952. You've been in America for 7 years. Why didn't you? What was I supposed to do, Dino? Walk up to the stage door and say, "Hi, I'm your dead brother"? You were becoming famous. I was nobody. A displaced person working construction, barely speaking English. I didn't want to embarrass you. Dean grabbed Antonio's shoulders. "Embarrass me? Tony, you're my blood. You're my family. Nothing else matters." The audience, which had been respectfully quiet during this extraordinary reunion, began to understand what they were witnessing. Someone started applauding, then another person, then the entire theater was on its feet, giving the brothers a standing ovation that seemed to acknowledge not just the moment, but the miracle of family love, surviving war, separation, and the cruel mathematics of fame. Dean looked around at the standing crowd, then back at his brother. "Tony, will you come up on stage with me?" Antonio's eyes widened with panic. "Oh no, Dino, I'm not a performer. I work with my hands. I build things. I don't belong up there." "You belong wherever I belong," Dean said firmly. "We're brothers. We're family. And family doesn't leave family in the audience." Slowly, gently, Dean led Antonio up onto the stage. The theater's lights seemed impossibly bright after the dimness of the seats, and Antonio squinted, clearly overwhelmed by the attention of 1,200 people. Dean walked to his microphone and addressed the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to share something with you. This is my brother Antonio. We were separated when we were children, and until 10 minutes ago, I thought he was dead. I've spent my entire career performing for strangers, but tonight, for the first time, I get to sing for my family." He turned to the orchestra leader. "Maestro, can you play That's Amore very softly? Just the melody." As the familiar tune began, Dean looked at his brother. "Tony, do you remember the lullabies Mama used to sing? The old Italian songs?" Antonio's face lit up with recognition. "Of course, how could I forget? Sing with me?" And then, on the stage of the Riverside Theater in Steubenville, Ohio, the famous Dean Martin and his unknown brother Antonio began to sing together. Not That's Amore in English, but old Italian folk songs their mother had taught them decades ago. Songs about home and family and love that endures across oceans and years. Antonio's voice was untrained but pure, shaped by years of singing while he worked, while he mourned, while he hoped for a reunion he never quite believed would happen. Dean's voice, polished by years of professional performance, seemed to find a new authenticity as it blended with his brother's rougher tones. They sang Mama, the heartbreaking ballad about maternal love that had made their mother cry every time she heard it on the radio. They sang Torna a Sorrento, the Neapolitan classic about longing for home. And finally, they sang a simple folk song about brothers separated by fate but reunited by love, a song their grandmother had taught them during Antonio's brief stay in Italy. The audience was transfixed. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was something approaching sacred ritual, a family healing its wounds in public, two voices that had been silenced by history finding harmony again. When the last note faded, the theater was absolutely quiet for several heartbeats. Then the applause began again, but it was different this time, softer, more reverent. The kind of applause you give not to performers but to witnesses of grace. Dean walked to the edge of the stage, still holding his brother's hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most important show I've ever done. Not because you're here, though I'm grateful for that, but because he's here." He squeezed Antonio's hand. "My whole life, I've been singing about love and family and home. Tonight, I finally understand what those words really mean." After the show, Dean and Antonio sat in Dean's dressing room, sharing a bottle of wine and filling in the gaps of 43 lost years. Antonio told Dean about surviving the bombing, about walking across a devastated Europe as a displaced person, about working his way to America with nothing but the clothes on his back, and a dream of finding his famous brother. "I came to your shows whenever you performed within driving distance," Antonio explained. "I must have seen you perform 20 times over the years. I always sat in the back, always bought the cheapest seats. I told myself I was just checking on you, making sure you were happy and healthy. But really, I was trying to feel connected to the only family I had left." Dean was overwhelmed by the image of his brother sitting alone in the back rows of theaters and nightclubs, a ghost watching from the darkness while Dean performed under bright lights, neither of them knowing how close they were to healing a wound that had shaped both their lives. "Tony, I want you to know something," Dean said. "Every time I sang about missing someone, every time I sang about family, I was singing about you. You were the voice inside the voice, the heartbreak that made the happy songs true." From that night forward, Antonio became a permanent part of Dean's inner circle. Dean bought his brother a house in California, close enough for daily visits. He made sure Antonio had everything he'd missed during their decades apart: security, comfort, and most importantly, the knowledge that he was loved and wanted. But Antonio, true to his character, refused to become a show business ornament. He continued working construction, though now by choice rather than necessity. "I need to build things with my hands," he told Dean. "It keeps me connected to the real world, to the world you came from too." The brothers developed a routine. Before every performance, Dean would look into the audience and find Antonio's face, usually in the middle rows now, no longer hiding in the back. It became Dean's anchor, his reminder of who he really was beneath the spotlight and the applause. Years later, when Dean's own son died in that plane crash, it was Antonio who held him together, Antonio who sat with him through the darkest nights of grief, Antonio who reminded him that family is the only thing that survives when everything else falls apart. The story of the reunion spread through Steubenville and beyond, but Dean never exploited it for publicity. He never told the story on talk shows or used it in interviews. It was too sacred for that, too personal to become entertainment. But those who were in the Riverside Theater that October night never forgot what they witnessed. They'd seen something impossible, a man finding his lost heart in the middle of a performance, a family healing itself through the power of song, two voices finding harmony after decades of silence. In a world where fame often separates people from their authentic selves, Dean Martin discovered that the most important audience was the one that knew him before he became famous. The one that loved him not for what he could do, but for who he was. The night Dean found his lost brother in row 7 became the night he found himself again, the night the performer remembered that he was first and always Dino Crocetti, a barber's son from Steubenville, who happened to be able to sing.